October 14, 1863, Bristoe Station, Virginia. The Union regiment was falling back. Confederate artillery hammered their position with shell after shell. Officers shouted orders to retreat. Soldiers grabbed their equipment and ran. Within minutes, the position was abandoned. Almost. One man lay on the ground, unable to move. A Confederate shell fragment had torn through his leg. When his regiment retreated, they had no choice. They left him behind. Now he lay in no man's land, halfway between the Union lines and the Confederate artillery that was still firing. Every man in both armies knew the rule. You don't go back for one soldier when artillery is falling. It's suicide. But Assistant Surgeon Joseph K. Corson didn't care about rules. He looked at that wounded soldier, lying exposed on the battlefield. He looked at the Confederate artillery positions. He knew exactly what would happen if he walked out there. And then he grabbed a hospital attendant and said, "We're going to get him." In the next 20 minutes, Joseph Corson would prove that some lives are worth any risk. But his story didn't start on that battlefield. It started 27 years earlier in a Quaker family that valued healing above all else. Joseph Kirby Corson was born on November 22, 1836, in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, a quiet Quaker community northwest of Philadelphia. His family estate, Maple Hill, sat on land the Corsons had owned for generations. His father, Dr. Hiram Corson, was a respected physician. His mother, Anne Jones Falk Corson, came from another prominent Quaker medical family. Joseph was the second of 9 children. He grew up in a home where education, service, and healing were the highest values. His father hired private tutors for Joseph's early education. Later, Joseph attended Tremont Seminary in nearby Norristown, where he excelled in science and mathematics. But Joseph didn't immediately follow his father into medicine. In 1856, at age 20, he moved to Philadelphia to work as an apprentice in a drugstore owned by William and John Savory. For 2 years, Joseph learned the pharmaceutical trade, mixing medicines, understanding chemistry, and serving customers. In 1858, he graduated from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy with a degree in pharmacy. Joseph tried to establish himself in business. He moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, to work with a pharmacist there, but the business failed. Joseph returned to Pennsylvania, disappointed but not defeated. He partnered in a cousin's lime business in Norristown. It wasn't pharmacy or medicine, but it was honest work. Then, everything changed. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Across the North, young men rushed to enlist. The prevailing opinion was that the war would be over in 3 months. One big battle, the South would surrender, everyone would go home. Joseph Corson was 24 years old. He had spent years training in pharmacy and chemistry. He understood how the human body worked, and he knew that this war, however short people thought it would be, would produce casualties. Those casualties would need doctors. 8 days after Fort Sumter, Joseph enlisted in Company K of the 4th Pennsylvania Infantry as a corporal. It was a 90-day volunteer regiment. The men trained briefly, marched to Washington, and waited for the great battle that would end the war. That battle came on July 21, 1861, at Bull Run. The Union Army attacked Confederate positions near Manassas, Virginia. For most of the day, it seemed like the North would win. Then Confederate reinforcements arrived. The Union attack collapsed. Soldiers ran. The 90-day volunteers, including Joseph's regiment, were swept up in the panicked retreat back to Washington. Joseph Corson was discharged on July 26, 1861, at the rank of sergeant. He had seen just enough of war to know 3 things. First, it wasn't going to be over quickly. Second, the casualties were going to be enormous. Third, the Army desperately needed doctors. In September 1861, Joseph enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. For the next 18 months, he studied anatomy, surgery, and medicine, while also serving as a medical cadet at the Army Hospital at Broad and Cherry Streets in Philadelphia. Joseph saw wounded soldiers streaming back from battles at places like Antietam and Fredericksburg. He learned battlefield surgery under men who had treated thousands of wounded. He learned to identify infections. He learned that in Civil War medicine, speed and decisiveness saved more lives than gentleness. Joseph graduated with his medical degree in March 1863. 3 days later, on March 23rd, he was commissioned as Assistant Surgeon of the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves, otherwise known as the 35th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He was 26 years old. He had spent 7 years preparing to heal people. Now he would spend the next 15 months seeing just how much damage war could do to the human body. The 6th Pennsylvania Reserves was part of the Army of the Potomac, the main Union force in the Eastern Theater. In the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee invaded the North, hoping to win a decisive victory that might force the Union to negotiate peace. The Army of the Potomac, under General Meade, met Lee's army at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Joseph Corson was there. For 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, the two armies tore each other apart. Joseph worked in field hospitals, treating wounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Men with faces blown away by artillery, men with limbs shattered by rifle bullets, men gut-shot, dying slowly in agony. Joseph and his fellow surgeons worked around the clock, moving from one man to the next, doing what they could, which was often not enough. Gettysburg was a Union victory, but it didn't end the war. Lee's army escaped back to Virginia. The Union army followed. Through the late summer and fall of 1863, the two armies maneuvered across northern Virginia, looking for advantage. There were small battles at Falling Waters, Manassas Gap, and Rappahannock Station. Joseph Corson was at all of them, treating wounded after each engagement. By October 1863, both armies were exhausted. Lee was trying to maintain his defensive line south of the Rappahannock River. Meade was trying to turn Lee's flank and force him to retreat. On October 14th, elements of the two armies collided near Bristoe Station, a small railroad stop about 35 miles southwest of Washington. The Battle of Bristoe Station was supposed to be a Confederate ambush. General A.P. Hill's corps spotted what they thought was an isolated Union corps moving along the railroad. Hill ordered an immediate attack, but Hill made a critical mistake. There was another Union corps hidden behind a railroad embankment. When Hill's men attacked, they walked into a trap. Union soldiers, protected by the railroad embankment, poured devastating fire into the Confederate advancing. Confederate artillery tried to suppress the Union position, but they couldn't dislodge the defenders. After brutal fighting, the Confederates were forced to withdraw. It was a Union victory, but victories in the Civil War always came with a price. Joseph Corson's regiment, the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves, had been in the thick of the fighting. When the regiment was ordered to fall back to consolidate the Union line, the men retreated under heavy Confederate artillery fire. They took their wounded with them when they could, but some men were too badly hurt to move. Some men were pinned down by artillery fire. Those men had to be left behind. One of those men was a soldier whose name has lost to history. We don't know his rank. We don't know his age. We don't know if he had a family waiting for him at home. All we know is that he lay on the battlefield at Bristoe Station on October 14, 1863, severely wounded, unable to move, abandoned between the lines while Confederate artillery continued to fire. Joseph Corson finished treating the wounded who had made it back to the Union position. Someone told him about the soldier still out there, probably an officer, delivering the information with the unspoken understanding that nothing could be done. The man was in no man's land. Confederate artillery was still active. Sending men back would just create more casualties. You accept the loss and move on. Joseph asked where the soldier was. Someone pointed. Joseph could see him, lying maybe 100 yards away. Between Joseph and that wounded man was open ground. Confederate artillery had a clear line of fire. Military doctrine was clear. You don't risk 2 lives to save 1 life that's probably already lost. You don't send unarmed medical personnel into active artillery fire. You accept the loss and move on. Joseph Corson looked at that wounded soldier. Then he looked at a hospital attendant standing nearby and said, "Come with me." The attendant stared at him. Going out there was certain death. Joseph started walking. The hospital attendant hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, then he followed. Soldiers from both sides watched as 2 unarmed men walked out onto the battlefield. Joseph Corson wore his surgeon's uniform. He carried no weapon. He walked steadily, not running, not crouching. He walked like a man who had already accepted whatever was about to happen. Confederate artillery crews saw them. Officers shouted orders, but Confederate artillery was not designed for precision targeting of individual soldiers. The guns continued firing at the Union position. Some shells landed near Joseph and the attendant. They didn't stop. They reached the wounded soldier. Joseph knelt beside him and made a quick assessment. The man was badly hurt, but if they could get him back to the field hospital quickly, he might survive. Joseph told the attendant to take the soldier's left side. Joseph took the right. Together they lifted him. The wounded man cried out in pain. Moving him was agony, but leaving him was death. They started back. Confederate artillery fire intensified. Whether the gunners were deliberately targeting the rescue party or just continuing their bombardment of the Union position, shells began landing closer. One explosion threw dirt over all 3 men. Another landed close enough that the concussion knocked them off balance. Joseph and the attendant didn't let go of the wounded soldier. They kept walking. Union soldiers, watching from their position, began laying down covering fire, shooting at the Confederate artillery to try to suppress it. But they were too far away to be effective. The artillery kept firing. Joseph counted his steps, 70 yards back to safety, 60. The wounded soldier was heavy. Joseph's arms were burning. The attendant beside him was struggling, breathing hard, probably praying. 50 yards. Another shell exploded to their left. Fragments of metal whistled past them. Joseph felt something hot streak past his face. He didn't look to see what it was. 40 yards. Union soldiers at the defensive position started moving forward, ready to help the moment Joseph and the attendant got close enough. 30 yards. 20. One final shell landed behind them, close enough that the blast pushed them forward. Joseph stumbled but didn't fall. 10 yards. Union soldiers rushed out, taking the wounded man from Joseph and the attendant, pulling all 3 back behind the railroad embankment. Cheers erupted along the Union line. Men who had been watching in stunned silence broke into applause. Even some Confederate soldiers, the ones who could see what had just happened, were seen nodding in respect. Joseph Corson collapsed against the embankment, breathing hard, his arms shaking. The hospital attendant sat beside him, pale and trembling. The wounded soldier was rushed to the field hospital. He survived, because Joseph Corson decided that one life was worth walking through artillery fire. The Battle of Bristoe Station ended in a Union victory. The Confederates withdrew. The fighting moved elsewhere. The war ground on. Joseph Corson continued serving with the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves. In the spring of 1864, the Army of the Potomac launched a new offensive into Virginia. General Ulysses S. Grant, now in overall command of Union forces, intended to engage Lee's army continuously until one side broke. The result was the Overland Campaign, a series of brutal battles that produced staggering casualties. Joseph Corson was at the Battle of the Wilderness in early May 1864, treating wounded in dense forest that caught fire, burning wounded men alive. He was at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where fighting lasted 2 weeks and produced some of the war's most horrific casualties. He was at the North Anna River, at Cold Harbor, at the Siege of Petersburg. For his service during the Wilderness Campaign, Joseph was brevetted to the rank of Major. It was an honor recognizing his skill and courage under impossible conditions. But Joseph didn't seek recognition. He just kept working, treating wounded soldiers, saving lives when he could, easing suffering when he couldn't. The war finally ended in April 1865. Joseph mustered out in May and returned to Plymouth Meeting. He joined his father's medical practice. For 2 years, Joseph treated civilian patients, trying to readjust to a world at peace. But something was missing. In October 1867, Joseph rejoined the United States Army as an assistant surgeon with the rank of first lieutenant. For the next 30 years, he served at military posts across the country: Alabama, Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Missouri, Nebraska, New York, Texas, Wyoming. Wherever the Army needed doctors, Joseph went. In 1871, while stationed at Fort Bridger, Wyoming in 1874, Joseph served as assistant surgeon on the King Survey, a geological expedition mapping the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The expedition named a peak in Utah after him. Corson Peak stands today as a permanent reminder of his service. While stationed at Fort Bridger, Wyoming in 1874, Joseph met Mary Ada Carter, daughter of Judge William Carter. According to family legend, Joseph had competition for Ada's hand in the form of Arthur MacArthur, who would later become the father of General Douglas MacArthur and a Medal of Honor recipient himself. Joseph won. They married in 1874 and had 2 children. Their daughter, Mary Carter Corson, was born in 1876 at Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. She grew up moving from post to post with her parents. For better educational opportunities, her parents sent her to school in Philadelphia. In June 1890, Mary was returning home after a year away when the train she was traveling on went over an embankment. She was 14 years old when she died from her injuries.
Joseph and Ada's grief was profound, but they had their son, Edward Fouke Corson, born in 1883. Edward would follow his father and grandfather into medicine, graduating from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and becoming the 17th member of the Corson family in 5 generations to earn a medical degree from Penn. Joseph continued his military service. He was promoted to major in November 1888. He collected fossils as a hobby, discovering specimens of Eocene mammals in Wyoming that he donated to Professor Joseph Leidy at the University of Pennsylvania. He collected Native American artifacts, including a Yavapai quiver that eventually became part of the collection at the National Museum of the American Indian. In November 1897, after 30 years of continuous service, Joseph retired from the Army. He returned to Plymouth Meeting and his family home, Maple Hill. He was 60 years old. He had served his country in war and peace for over 3 decades. He had saved countless lives. But for 36 years, no one had officially recognized what he did at Bristoe Station. The military had records of the rescue. Officers had filed reports. The hospital attendant who went with Joseph had confirmed the story. But in the chaos of war and its aftermath, the paperwork had been lost or forgotten. Joseph never pushed for recognition. He didn't write about his rescue. He didn't give speeches. He just went back to being a doctor. Then, in 1899, someone in the War Department reviewed old battle reports from Bristoe Station. They found the witness statements describing Joseph's rescue of the wounded soldier under artillery fire. Multiple sources confirmed the story. The evidence was overwhelming. On May 13, 1899, at the age of 62, Joseph Kirby Corson was awarded the Medal of Honor, 36 years after walking through artillery fire to save a dying man. The citation read, "With one companion returned in the face of the enemy's heavy artillery fire and removed to a place of safety a severely wounded soldier who had been left behind as the regiment fell back." Simple words for extraordinary courage. Joseph lived another 14 years. He continued his medical practice when his health allowed. He was a founding member of the Patriotic Order Sons of America and stayed active in veterans organizations. He was known as a kind, gentle man who never turned away patients who couldn't pay. On July 24, 1913, Joseph Kirby Corson died at his home in Plymouth Meeting. He was 76 years old. He was buried at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Ballackinwood, Pennsylvania. His Medal of Honor citation is engraved on his headstone. Today, most Americans have never heard of Joseph Corson. There are no movies about him, no television documentaries, no dramatic reenactments of his rescue at Bristoe Station. Corson Peak in Utah still bears his name, but few people who see it know the story behind it. History remembers the generals, the famous battles, the turning points. It rarely remembers the doctors who walked through artillery fire to save one wounded soldier. But for October 14, 1863, Joseph Corson proved something important. He proved that in the middle of a war that killed over 600,000 men, one life still mattered. One wounded soldier lying in no man's land was worth risking everything for. Joseph Corson came from a family that valued healing above all else. He spent 7 years training to save lives. He spent 4 years in the Civil War seeing how easily lives could be destroyed. And when military doctrine said to leave a wounded man behind, Joseph Corson said no. That's not heroism born from recklessness or glory-seeking. That's heroism born from a deep, unshakable belief that every human life has value, that no man should die alone on a battlefield if there's any chance to save him, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is refusing to accept that some deaths are inevitable. Joseph Corson didn't just save one soldier at Bristoe Station. He saved the idea that in the midst of war's chaos and horror, human compassion can still break through, that a doctor's oath to do no harm extends even into artillery fire, that courage doesn't always mean charging into battle. Sometimes it means walking calmly into danger because someone needs help. This is the story of Joseph Kirby Corson, a pharmacist who became a doctor, an assistant surgeon who became a major, a man who walked through artillery fire because one life was worth saving, a hero who waited 36 years for recognition and never once complained about the wait. His name deserves to be remembered. His courage deserves to be honored. And now, 161 years after that desperate rescue at Bristoe Station, we're finally telling his story. If you believe Joseph Corson's story deserves to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe to Forgotten Battlefront. We're bringing back the heroes history forgot, one story at a time.